Darius stood in the hallway, cardboard box in hand, and watched three men in tailored suits walk through the glass doors of the main conference room. They carried slim laptops and thick portfolios. He recognized all of them not because they were rivals, but because he was the one who had taught them every first command, every crisis response sequence, every system blueprint they were now carrying in to replace him. CEO Vivian had just paid $200,000 a year for each of them. She had no idea that the man she had fired 9 days ago at $80,000 a year was the one who had created them. They replaced him with the very people he created. But what happens when the whole system falls apart? The morning had started the way most mornings started for Darius. His alarm went off at 5:45 and he was in the kitchen by 5:50, packing Maya's lunchbox with a peanut butter sandwich, an apple cut into quarters, and 3 crackers arranged in a triangle because she had once told him triangles were her favorite shape, and he had never stopped doing it since. Maya was 6 years old and had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness and a stuffed rabbit named Cookie that went everywhere she went. She came into the kitchen with her hair half loose, 2 careful braids her father had done the night before, now coming undone, dragging Cookie by one ear, and climbed onto the bar stool the way she always did, not gracefully but completely throwing her whole small body into the effort. "Daddy," she said, "are you going to get yelled at today?" Darius finished wrapping the sandwich. The morning light caught the side of his face, the close-cut fade his barber, Mr. Reggie, had given him last Saturday. The same barber who had been cutting his hair since he moved to the city 11 years ago. "Nobody yells at me at work, Maya." Ryan's dad gets yelled at. He says his boss has a loud voice. "My boss doesn't yell." He turned and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his dark hand gentle against her cheek. She mostly sends emails. Maya accepted this with the seriousness of a child who had not yet decided whether emails were better or worse than yelling. She ate her cereal. There is something worth pausing on here in the small architecture of this morning. A father packs a lunchbox the same way for the 1,000th time, arranges crackers in a triangle, braids hair the night before, so the morning has fewer battles. None of this will appear in any performance review. None of it will be measured by the company that employs him. And yet this is the real work of a life, the quiet, repeated acts of care that no spreadsheet can capture. The world tends to value what it can count, but what holds families together is almost always the uncountable. Darius put on his jacket, the same gray technical jacket he wore every day. The fabric at the right cuff slightly worn from 3 years of resting against desk edges, and tied her shoes when she held her feet out, and they left together at 6:30, her hand in his cookie tucked under her other arm. Nobody looking at Darius in that jacket, in those scuffed work shoes with that small girl beside him, would have guessed much about him. That was not an accident. That was a choice he had made 3 years ago, and had not unmade since. Meridian Systems occupied 12 floors of a tower in the financial district and employed just under 1,400 people. It built and managed enterprise data infrastructure, the invisible plumbing that kept other companies' operations running in real time. Its flagship product was AmeriCore Grid, a distributed data routing network that served 47 large corporate clients, simultaneously handling transaction flows, operational databases, and time-sensitive communications across industries. Without AmeriCore Grid, the banks couldn't process overnight settlements on schedule. The logistics firm in Dallas couldn't track its fleet. The regional hospital network in the Mid-Atlantic couldn't push patient records between facilities fast enough to matter. AmeriCore Grid was not glamorous. It was essential. It was the kind of system that nobody thought about until it stopped working, at which point it became the only thing anyone thought about. Darius's official title was Senior Maintenance Technician. He had chosen that title himself 3 years ago when he asked to step down from his previous role. And whoever had processed the paperwork had not looked twice at the request, because people rarely stepped down and therefore nobody had a protocol for questioning why someone would want to. Before the paperwork, before the demotion he had requested quietly and without drama, Darius had been Meridian's principal systems architect. He had designed AmeriCore Grid from the first specification. He had written the core routing logic by hand, over 14 months testing edge cases at night on a second-hand workstation in the spare room of the apartment back when Maya was still too young to stay up as late as he was working. He had built the thermal management module, a subsystem he called Thermal Sync, from scratch, because nothing on the market handled the specific combination of load variance and ambient heat that Meridian's server environment produced in summer. He had trained the teams that maintained what he built. He had written the documentation. He had filed the internal architecture reviews. He had been for 4 years the person most responsible for the thing that made Meridian worth what it was worth. Then his wife Camille died. He did not talk about that. There was a photograph on the refrigerator at home, a woman with warm brown skin and a smile that filled the whole frame, holding a much smaller Maya at a beach somewhere. He looked at it every morning and every night, and most days that was as much as he could bring himself to do. He had told HR he needed a reduced stress role for personal reasons, and HR had nodded and produced paperwork, and Darius had signed it. And the next Monday he came in as a maintenance technician, and the Monday after that, and the Monday after that, and eventually it became simply who he was at this building. He liked it in the honest part of himself where he kept the things that were true regardless of whether they were flattering. The work was concrete. Something was broken. He fixed it. Something needed a check. He ran the check. Nobody asked him to sit through 4-hour strategy sessions about product positioning. Nobody sent him decks about market differentiation. He fixed things. He went home. He made dinner. He read Maya a story. He slept without his mind, cycling through architectural decisions at 2 o'clock in the morning. It was not glamorous, but it gave him his daughter back. And his daughter was the only return on investment that had ever truly mattered to him. Every morning he walked through the server corridor on his way to his desk. And every morning he paused for a few seconds beside the primary rack assembly. Not long enough for anyone to notice, just long enough to listen. He could tell by sound and by the almost imperceptible shift in airflow whether the system was running clean. He knew the rhythms of it the way a person knows the sounds of their own house in the dark. He knew which fans ran slightly louder in high load. He knew the faint tick that Node 7 produced when the ambient temperature in that quadrant crossed 92 degrees Fahrenheit. He knew things that were not in any document, because some of what he knew had never been written down, and some of what had been written down had been filed in places where the people who needed it had not thought to look. He also knew about Bradley. Bradley was Meridian's chief operating officer. 45 years old, a man who wore authority the way some men wore a watch expensively and with constant attention to whether other people noticed. He had been at Meridian 8 years, and in that time had developed a talent for identifying which people in the organization had the kind of knowledge that could become inconvenient. Darius had that kind of knowledge, not because he had looked for anything, but because in the course of running routine storage audits on the infrastructure, he had once opened a directory. He had not expected to contain anything of interest, and found encrypted correspondence between Bradley and an outside firm that had no public business relationship with Meridian. He had not opened the files. He had noted the directory path and moved on because it was not his concern, and he had not gone looking for trouble, and he did not want any. But he had noted it the way he noted everything, quietly, accurately, and without forgetting. Bradley did not know exactly what Darius had seen, but Bradley was the kind of man who was attuned to risk, and Darius represented a category of risk that Bradley found intolerable. A person with deep system access, a memory like a filing cabinet, and no particular reason to protect anyone's secrets. When the board appointed Vivian as the new CEO 6 weeks ago, Bradley had understood immediately that this was an opportunity. A new CEO had no existing map of the internal landscape. She would need guidance about what mattered and what didn't. Bradley was very good at providing that kind of guidance. Vivian had come to Meridian from a strategic consulting firm where she had spent 9 years telling large companies how to run themselves more efficiently. She was 35, precise, self-possessed, and genuinely smart. She read financial models the way other people read novels quickly, hungrily catching the implications that most readers missed. What she did not yet have, because she had only been in the building 6 weeks, was a reliable map of the human architecture underneath the org chart. She was working from documents and briefings and the impressions of people who were, in many cases, giving her the version of events that served their own interests. Bradley was the most fluent briefer she had encountered. His documentation was clean, his logic was sequential, and his recommendations always came with supporting data that appeared to confirm what he was saying. The slide deck he prepared on workforce optimization was 42 pages long. It contained a cost-per-output analysis of the technical operations team, a benchmarking comparison against industry compensation standards, and a section titled Strategic Capability Gaps that made a careful, measured argument for replacing the current maintenance and monitoring function with a specialized external team. The proposal included 3 candidates from a well-regarded technical consultancy, a team Bradley noted with credentials from the most respected institutions and companies in the sector. He mentioned Brandon's background at Google. He mentioned Megan's degree from MIT. He mentioned Trevor's years at Amazon Web Services. He presented their combined annual cost as an investment in future capability rather than a replacement expense. He did not mention that all 3 of them had learned the fundamentals of distributed systems architecture in an internal training program at Meridian. He did not mention who had designed and taught that program. Vivian approved the proposal in 15 minutes. She asked 3 questions, all of them financial, and received 3 clean answers. She signed the authorization and moved on to the next item on her agenda. Nobody in that room asked who was actually running the system every day. Nobody thought to ask. This is perhaps the moment to notice something that happens in many organizations and rarely gets named. There is the org chart, and then there is the actual map of who keeps the lights on. The two are almost never the same. The first is built from titles and salaries. The second is built from years of quiet, accumulated knowledge, the kind that lives in the head of someone who pauses by a server rack each morning to listen. When a decision maker confuses the first map for the second, the cost is rarely visible right away. But it always comes due eventually. Darius was eating a sandwich in the server room when HR found him. It was a Wednesday just past noon. Maya's school had a half day, and he had picked her up at 11:30 and brought her in with him rather than arrange last-minute childcare, which he did occasionally when schedules shifted unexpectedly. Maya was sitting on his jacket on the floor with Cookie drawing in a small notebook, completely absorbed. The server room was cool and hummed steadily, and she had been here enough times to know not to touch anything and to speak quietly, which she did, narrating a story she was telling Cookie under her breath. The HR representative was a young woman named Rebecca, who had clearly been asked to do something she found uncomfortable and was trying to get it done efficiently. She handed Darius a white envelope. She said the words the way people say words they have rehearsed. Position eliminated. Restructuring effective end of week 3-month severance return of access credentials. Darius put the sandwich down. He took the envelope and turned it over once in his hands. "Who's going to handle the phase drift condition on Node 7, he asked. Rebecca looked at him the way people look at someone who has said something in a language they almost recognize. "I'm sorry. Node 7. There's a thermal behavior that occurs under specific load conditions in high summer. It requires a particular response sequence or it cascades. Has anyone briefed the incoming team on that?" Rebecca's expression indicated that she had not been briefed on Node 7 or phase drift or thermal behavior, and that she was not sure what any of it meant, and that she was very much hoping this conversation would end soon. "The incoming team has been given full access to the system documentation," she said carefully. Darius nodded once. He put the envelope in his jacket pocket. He turned back to the terminal and completed the task he had been running when she walked in a minor routing anomaly he had caught that morning. The kind of thing that wouldn't cause a problem today but would eventually if left unaddressed. He ran the correction, verified the results, saved the log, and then stood up. "Thank you, Rebecca," he said. He folded his jacket over his arm. He picked up Maya's notebook and her crayon tin and handed them to her, and Maya gathered Cookie and stood up, and they walked out together. As they crossed the main floor toward the elevator, they passed the conference room where the glass walls showed the three men in suits being walked through the space by Bradley. There was a small gathering of curious employees watching the introduction. Someone was clapping. Brandon was the one who saw Darius first. He was mid-sentence when his eyes moved past Bradley's shoulder and landed on the man with the cardboard box and the small girl. Something crossed Brandon's face recognition, and then something more complicated than recognition. He half raised one hand. Bradley stepped to the side, angling Brandon's attention back toward the room, and the moment passed. Vivian was standing at the top of the wide staircase that overlooked the floor. She was looking at the conference room, satisfied with how the introduction was going, when she noticed the man with the box walking toward the lobby. A child was beside him. The child was holding a rabbit. The man moved without hurry, which struck Vivian briefly as unusual for someone carrying out their belongings, and then she looked away and turned back to the conversation she had been having. In the lobby, the security guard at the front desk was a man named Walter, who had worked the morning shift for 5 years and knew every regular employee by name and most of them by coffee order. He came around the desk when he saw Darius. "Mr. Darius," he said, and held the door. There was a brief exchange between them, a small nod between two black men who had spent enough years in buildings like this to recognize a particular kind of moment when it arrived. "Thank you, Walter," Darius said. "Of course." Walter held the door until they were through. He didn't ask any questions. He had learned over 5 years to read a situation. Outside, Maya tugged Darius's hand and looked up at him. The afternoon was bright and warm. "Daddy, those men inside, the ones in the nice jackets, what about them? Did you know them?" Darius looked down the block. "Yes. How I taught them things." Maya considered this. "So they're your students?" "They were. Are they smarter than you now?" Darius thought about that for a moment. Not about whether it was true, but about how to answer a 6-year-old honestly, without being either cruel or dishonest. "They know a lot," he said. "They're very good." Maya accepted this. She swung his hand once. "Can we get ice cream?" "Yes," he said. "We can get ice cream." He did not look back at the building. There is a kind of strength that does not announce itself. It walks out of a building holding a child's hand and stops for ice cream, and the world never sees what it cost or what it carried. If there is anything to take from this part of the story, perhaps it is this. A person's worth is not handed to them by an institution, and so it cannot be taken away by one. The titles people give us and the titles they take from us are never the deepest measure of who we are. What we do for the small, true loves of our lives that measure stays. That evening, after Maya was asleep with Cookie tucked under her chin, Darius sat at the kitchen table with his personal laptop open. He was not browsing job listings. He had already received 2 messages from former colleagues at other firms before he had even gotten home. The professional network that surrounds anyone with real expertise tends to move quickly. When word circulates that someone is available, he would look at those messages tomorrow. Tonight, he was working on something else. He had been building a document for the past several months. A comprehensive operational guide for AmeriCorps Grid, written the way he would write a guide for someone who had to keep the system alive alone at 3 o'clock in the morning with no one to call. Not a high-level architecture document, not a glossy internal wiki entry, a real document. Step-by-step failure responses, edge case behaviors cataloged by the conditions that triggered them, manual override sequences for every known anomaly, and at the center of it, a detailed entry on thermals, the module he had built and never fully documented in any official system, the subsystem that managed the thermal behavior of Node 7 under summer load conditions. He worked for 2 hours, he wrote carefully. At a certain point, he added a note in the thermal sync section. Phase drift node 7 activation conditions. Ambient temperature combined with simultaneous load exceeding 94% of peak capacity occurs July through August. Thermal sync state memory must not be reset during remediation. Reinitialization sequence required if state is lost. He wrote out the reinitialization sequence in full. He saved the document to his personal drive. He did not send it to anyone at Meridian. He sat there for a moment looking at the screen. Then he closed the laptop, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. Brandon, Megan, and Trevor had their kickoff meeting with Vivian and Bradley on the following Monday. They presented a roadmap that was objectively impressive, an 18-month phased plan to modernize the infrastructure layer, reduce cloud spend by an estimated 17%, and expand the system's capacity to onboard new enterprise clients. The slide deck was polished. The Q&A was fluent. Vivian sat through it with her arms folded and her expression attentive, asking pointed questions that the three of them answered well. After the meeting, walking back to the technical operations floor, Brandon pulled up the original AmeriCorps grid architecture files in the shared repository. He was thorough enough to want to understand the foundation before he started building on it. He opened the folder, skimmed the top file, dense, unusually written, organized around principles rather than standards, with hand-annotated diagrams that did not follow any convention he had been trained on, and then closed it. "Old school style," he said to Megan. "We'll need to refactor the documentation before we can build on it properly." Megan nodded. They moved on. It is worth noticing how easily good people make bad decisions when they assume that what they don't recognize must be obsolete. Brandon was not careless. He was capable, well-trained, and conscientious. But he had been taught to trust the conventions of his education above the unfamiliar elegance of someone else's thinking. There is a quiet arrogance in always preferring what is standard to what is wise, and it is one of the most common mistakes a competent person can make. The first 2 weeks were smooth. Brandon identified 3 redundant processes in the monitoring layer and eliminated them. Megan optimized a database indexing routine that had been running inefficiently. Trevor tightened up the traffic routing logic on 4 secondary nodes. Vivian received weekly progress summaries that reflected real measurable improvements. Bradley reviewed them with visible satisfaction. What none of them knew, what no one on the current team knew, was that by eliminating one of those redundant processes, Brandon had removed the secondary check that ThermalSync used to validate its state memory before engaging the thermal compensation protocol. The process had not looked redundant from the outside. From the outside, it had looked like a duplicate logging function. Removing it was a reasonable call given everything Brandon knew. The problem was that Brandon did not know about ThermalSync. And ThermalSync was the thing that kept Node 7 from drifting under summer heat load conditions. And it was the first week of August. The night it happened was a Wednesday, which was the same day of the week Darius had been handed his termination letter. Though no one who noticed this coincidence was in a position to find it significant. The temperature outside had reached 96 degrees by 4 in the afternoon and had not fallen below 88 by midnight. It was the 4th consecutive day of a heat event that the weather services were calling historic. Inside the Meridian server facility, the climate control systems were working at capacity, and the ambient temperature in the Node 7 quadrant had been reading at 93.2 degrees since 10 p.m., not yet at the threshold, but close. The system began showing irregular behavior at 11:47 in the evening, small latency spikes on the Node 7 routing table. The automated monitoring flagged them as moderate priority alerts. At 11:52, the latency spikes became cascading errors as ThermalSync, no longer able to validate its state memory through the process Brandon had removed, began cycling in an error loop. By midnight and 3 minutes, the primary routing layer of AmeriCorps grid went offline. 47 enterprise clients lost connectivity simultaneously. Vivian received the call from Bradley at 12:05. She was in her home office still working, which was not unusual for her. Bradley's voice was controlled, but she had learned to read the specific quality of his control, and this was the quality that meant something had gone badly wrong. "How long?" she asked. "We don't know yet. Get Brandon's team in." Now the 3 of them were in the building by 12:15, phones still warm from the calls that had woken them. The server room was lit the way it was lit at any hour, the same flat, steady light. but the screens were full of error states, and the atmosphere was different in a way that experienced technical people recognize immediately. The atmosphere of a system that has stopped cooperating. Brandon made his first diagnosis at 12:22. Load balancer failure on node 7. The fix was a restart. They restarted node 7. The system did not come back. Megan took the next pass. Database replication error. The restart had introduced a state mismatch between nodes. She recommended rolling back to a snapshot from 6 hours earlier. The rollback took 22 minutes. The system came back online at 12:57. It ran for 4 minutes and 17 seconds and then collapsed again harder than before, cascading across 3 additional nodes. Trevor took the third attempt. The routing tables he determined were corrupted not from the original failure, but from the botched rollback which had written partial state data across the network. He began a manual rebuild of the routing table. The rebuild took 47 minutes. The system came back at 2:13 in the morning. It ran for 9 minutes. Then it failed completely. Every primary node in MaryCore grid went dark. The backup failover systems designed for brief outages were not architected for this class of cascading failure. They held for 6 minutes and then they too went quiet. Vivian stood in the corner of the server room in the clothes she had been wearing when she got the call, slacks, a dark blouse, shoes she had not bothered to change. She had a cup of coffee that had been hot when Walter at the front desk had handed it to her an hour ago and was now entirely cold. She watched Brandon sit in front of a terminal with his hands still above the keyboard and not moving. She watched Megan go through the same sequence of screens for the 5th time. She watched Trevor stare at the routing rebuild log with an expression that she had not seen on a confident person's face before, and did not have a name for yet, but which she understood to mean that he had reached the boundary of what he knew and could not see the other side. She looked at Bradley. Bradley was standing near the door with his arms crossed. He was not looking at the screens. He was looking at the floor. His face had a gray quality to it that had nothing to do with the lighting. "Find a solution," she said. Right now, Brandon was still sitting alone in front of the terminal at 2:17 in the morning. The others had stepped out into the corridor, Megan to make calls, Trevor to review documentation on his laptop. Brandon was doing neither of those things. He was sitting in front of the screen looking at it. At the way a person looks at a problem that has stopped being a technical problem and become something else. He was thinking about the architecture document he had closed after 2 minutes 3 weeks ago. He was thinking about the hand-annotated diagrams that didn't follow any standard convention. He was thinking about a training session he had attended 4 years ago in a small conference room on the 8th floor when he was 25 years old and had just joined Meridian as a junior engineer. And a man in a plain gray jacket had drawn a diagram on a whiteboard and explained the concept of thermal state drift in distributed systems and why any serious infrastructure architecture needed to account for it from the ground up. He opened his phone. He scrolled to a contact he had not called in 2 years. The phone rang 3 times. "You already know," Brandon said when the line opened. It was not quite a question. "I left a condition in Node 7 when I handed things over," Darius said. His voice was even unhurried. "It wasn't intentional. I was going to come back and address it. I'm sorry I didn't." Brandon said nothing for a moment. In the server room, a monitoring display cycled through a sequence of red indicators, found nothing to encourage, and cycled again. "Can you help?" Brandon asked. "I need to speak with your CEO." Brandon stood up. He put the phone against his chest and walked to the door and found Vivian in the corridor. "There's someone on the phone," he said. "You need to talk to him. There is a lesson here that arrives quietly and does not raise its voice. When a system fails, the first instinct is often to look for someone to blame. But the deeper instinct, the one worth practicing, is to look for someone to learn from. The people we underestimate do not stop existing simply because we have stopped seeing them. The world we build together is held together by knowledge we did not put there ourselves, and humility is what allows us to find it again when we need it most. Pride closes that door. Humility opens it. Darius arrived at 2:38 in the morning wearing a gray t-shirt and dark pants, carrying nothing. He had left Maya with the neighbor one floor up, a retired school teacher named Eleanor, who had a standing arrangement with Darius for exactly these occasions, and who had told him when he knocked on her door at 2:15 only to go and not worry, which he had tried to do. The taxi had taken 11 minutes. When he came through the front entrance, Walter was at the desk. Walter worked the midnight shift 2 days a week and had apparently drawn the short straw this particular Wednesday. "Mr. Darius," Walter said, and buzzed him through without a word beyond that. There was something in Walter's eyes, not surprise, not curiosity, just the steady recognition of a man who had seen enough nights in this building to know what this one meant. Vivian was waiting in the corridor outside the server room. She had set the cold coffee down somewhere, and her arms were at her sides. She looked at Darius, the way she looked at every new variable in a situation directly without expression, trying to determine what category of thing it was. "You're the maintenance technician," she said. "I was," Darius said. "Brandon said you designed the system." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. There was a quality in her face that was not quite apology and not quite accusation, and was perhaps the particular expression of a person who has realized that the map they were given was missing a significant portion of the territory. She said, "You trained them, all three of them." Darius did not answer that. He looked past her at the server room door. "We can talk after the system is running. Is 4 hours enough to avoid the SLA penalty thresholds on the primary contracts?" Vivian blinked once. "The threshold is 5.5 hours from initial failure. We're at 2 hours and 35 minutes. Then we have time," Darius said, "but not a lot of it." He pushed the door open and walked in. Brandon and Megan and Trevor were all in the room. They turned when he entered. Nobody said anything for a moment. Darius looked at each of them in turn with an expression that was not anger and not satisfaction, and was not performing any particular emotion because he was already thinking about the problem. He sat down at the central terminal. He pulled the keyboard toward him. "Here's what happened," he said. He was not speaking to Vivian or to Bradley, who had positioned himself near the rear wall of the room. He was speaking to Brandon and Megan and Trevor, because they were the ones who needed to understand it if they were going to maintain this system after tonight. Maricore Grid has a thermal management subsystem I wrote called Thermal Sync. It manages the phase behavior of Node 7 under high ambient temperature and high simultaneous load. When those two conditions meet a specific threshold at the same time, temperature above 92 degrees combined with load above 94% of peak capacity, the system enters a compensatory state that prevents a cascade failure. He typed a sequence of commands, and the terminal displayed a directory structure that none of the three of them had seen before. The folder was nested 4 levels deep below the standard architecture directories named with a string of characters that had no obvious meaning. "Thermal Sync maintains a state memory," Darius continued. "That memory tells it where the system is in the compensation cycle. If the state memory is reset, for example, during a node restart, Thermal Sync loses its position and cycles into an error loop instead of a recovery loop. That's what caused the initial cascade." He paused. "The secondary check that prevented the state memory from being reset was removed 3 weeks ago. It looked like a redundant logging process from the outside. It wasn't." The silence in the room had a specific texture. Megan had her eyes closed. Trevor was looking at the floor. "I'm not saying that to assign blame," Darius said, and he meant it. His voice carried no edge. "The documentation on Thermal Sync was incomplete. That's my responsibility. I should have finalized it before I left." He turned back to the terminal. "The rollback made it worse because the snapshot didn't capture Thermal Sync state. So when the system came back, Thermal Sync was in a cold start condition in the middle of an active thermal event. The routing rebuild on top of that introduced a second layer of partial state data. Right now, the system thinks it's in 3 different operational modes simultaneously, which is why nothing is connecting." He began typing. The only way to recover from this is a manual reinitialization of thermal sync in the correct sequence, followed by a staged node restart that respects the thermal compensation timing. The sequence has to match the specific thermal state of the hardware. Right now, it's not a fixed procedure. You have to read the current conditions and adjust the timing intervals accordingly. He worked in silence for a few minutes. Brandon stood behind him and watched the command sequence on the screen with the focused attention of someone who was learning something he knows he will need to know again. The commands were not ones he recognized from any documentation or training. They were specific to thermal sync, specific to the architecture of AmeriCore Grid, specific to the mind that had built it. The intervals between Stage 3 and Stage 4 need to be extended right now because the ambient temperature is still above 90 degrees. Darius said, adjusting a parameter. If we rush it at this temperature, the state reassertion won't hold. We wait 6 minutes between those two stages. At 3:17, Node 7 came back online and held. At 3:29, the primary routing layer reconnected. At 3:44, AmeriCore Grid was fully operational. All 47 enterprise clients restored. The room was quiet in the specific way that a room is quiet after a long, difficult thing has ended. Brandon leaned against the rack beside the terminal. Megan let out a breath. Trevor sat down on a chair near the wall and put his head back. Darius ran a final verification sequence, not because he was unsure the system was stable, but because he was constitutionally unable to walk away from a critical system without confirming its status with his own eyes. The verification came back clean. He saved the session log and pushed the keyboard back. Vivian had not moved from her position near the door since she had come into the room to watch. She had watched the entire reinitialization without speaking, without asking questions, without looking at her phone. She had simply watched. Bradley had left the room at some point during the process. Darius had noted his absence and registered it without reaction. "Where's the documentation you mentioned?" Vivian asked. Her voice was careful. "The thermal sync documentation. It doesn't exist in the Meridian system," Darius said. "I was building a comprehensive guide on my personal drive. I hadn't finished it." "Can you share it?" "I'll finish it first." Vivian looked at him. She had the particular expression of someone who has learned that the model they were using to understand a situation was wrong and who is now recalibrating. It was not a comfortable expression, but it was an honest one, and Darius found it more trustworthy than comfort would have been. Brandon and Megan excused themselves to get coffee. Trevor followed. When the door closed, the server room was very quiet. Just the constant measured hum of the equipment, the sound that Darius had listened to at the beginning of every working day for 3 years as a form of orientation, a confirmation that everything was where it was supposed to be. Vivian sat in the chair Megan had vacated. She looked at Darius the way she looked at financial models when she was working through them. Seriously, without performance, without preamble. "I want to understand something," she said. "When HR delivered your termination notice, why didn't you say anything about your history with the system, about thermal sync, about any of it?" Darius considered how to answer this. He settled on the truth, which was also the simplest version. "Because you had already made the decision based on a document that described me as a maintenance technician. I didn't think there was anything I could tell you in that moment that would change how you read the situation. You would have needed context. That would have taken more time than a hallway conversation. You could have requested a meeting." "I could have," he agreed. "I asked the HR representative who would handle the Node 7 condition when I was gone. She didn't know what I was referring to. That told me what I needed to know about whether the information would land." Vivian looked at the terminal screen, still showing the clean verification results. "You left documentation behind that covered scenario partially. It was incomplete." He paused. "I did flag the issue verbally to the extent I could in that moment. It wasn't enough. That's also on me." There was a silence that was not awkward. It was the silence of two people looking at an honest accounting without flinching from what it showed. There is something rare in this exchange that deserves to be marked. Two people separated by power, by rank, by the circumstances that brought them into the same room at 4 in the morning, sitting down and telling each other the truth without performing for it. No defensiveness, no score-keeping, just the clean, difficult work of looking at what actually happened. This is in its quiet way what real leadership and real maturity look like: the willingness to be seen accurately, even when the accurate picture is uncomfortable. Most conflicts in life do not survive this kind of conversation. The trouble is, most people never have it. Bradley presented the restructuring proposal to me, Vivian said. He didn't disclose your role in building the system or in training the incoming team. No, Darius said. He wouldn't have. She looked at him. Why not? Darius was quiet for a moment. Then, there's a directory in the storage infrastructure. I can give you the path. I'd recommend reviewing it before you have any further conversations with Bradley about how the proposal came together. He wrote the path on a piece of paper from a notepad on the desk and set it in front of her. Vivian looked at it. She took out her phone, opened the internal file system, and navigated to the path. She read for approximately 4 minutes without speaking. Her face did not change expression, but the quality of her stillness changed. It became the stillness of someone who has just recalculated a large number and found that the total is very different from what they had been told. She set the phone face down on the desk. How long have you known about that? She asked. A while, Darius said. And you never... It wasn't my place to go looking for it. I came across it in the course of routine work. I noted it. I didn't go further. He looked at the humming rack beside him. I also didn't feel that going to Bradley's boss with something like that was a safe calculation, given that I had no standing and no clear evidence of anything beyond the existence of a directory. Vivian absorbed this. The way she did it carefully, without visible reaction, processing it internally before she was ready to speak, told Darius something about her that the past hour had been showing him incrementally. She was not a person who responded to information with the emotion she had not yet finished sorting. She was thorough. She had been given a bad map, but the way she was holding this new information suggested she was a good navigator. I want to make you an offer, she said. I should have been making this offer 9 days ago if I had understood what I was looking at. I want you to come back to Meridian not in the role you were in. I want you to take the role that actually matches what you do here, Chief Infrastructure Officer. You would oversee all system architecture and operations, report directly to me, have the headcount and resources to build the documentation and team structure that should have existed 3 years ago. Darius did not answer immediately. He looked at the screen. He looked at the paper with the file path that he had written and handed to her. He thought about Maya asleep in the apartment 1 floor below Eleanor's with Cookie under her chin, and the drawing pinned to the refrigerator and the shoes that needed a new pair by fall. I need to take Maya to school in the morning, he said. Vivian blinked. Give me 1 day, he said. I'll give you an answer by end of business tomorrow. He stood up, picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He looked at the terminal one final time, not because there was anything left to check, but the way a person looks at something they know well after a long and difficult night before they finally leave it. The door opened and Brandon came back in carrying 2 cups of coffee. He stopped when he saw Darius putting on his jacket. He held out one of the cups. Darius took it and drank from it standing up. You should reread the architecture notes on E9, Darius said. Not because anything's wrong with it, because the way I solved the load distribution problem in that module is the cleanest thing I ever designed here. You should understand why it works the way it does. Brandon held his own coffee cup with both hands. Something moved across his face, complicated, layered, not fully resolved. He nodded. Darius set the cup down. He shook Brandon's hand once briefly, without making anything of it. He nodded at Vivian. He walked out through the server room door. It was 6:12 in the morning. The sky outside the building was beginning to lighten. Not bright yet, but the particular deep blue that comes just before the city decides to be a day city again instead of a night one. Walter was still at the front desk, nearly at the end of his shift. He came around when he saw Darius cross the lobby. "Mr. Darius," he said, and held the door. "Good morning, Walter," Darius said. "Thank you." Long night, Darius considered this. "Productive," he said. Outside, the air was still warm from the day before. The heat had not released yet, but there was the faintest suggestion that it would eventually. Darius stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. He took out his phone and typed a message to Eleanor. "Home in 20 minutes. Thank you." He added a second message. "Tell Maya I'll make the good pancakes." He put his phone away and raised his hand for a cab. He did not know yet what he was going to tell Vivian. He did not know if going back was the right answer. The organization that had let him go 9 days ago had done so because of a failure of information, and that failure had lived at multiple levels in multiple people, and correcting it involved more than restoring one position on an org chart. He understood that. He was not certain that understanding it was enough to make the answer yes. What he did know was that Maya would be awake in 40 minutes, and that she would want to know if this was a pancake morning or a cereal morning, and that he had just promised her the good pancakes, and that a promise made to a 6-year-old with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness was not the kind of promise you reconsidered on the basis of complicated organizational considerations. He knew that whatever he decided, he would decide it clearly, honestly, and after he had slept. And he knew that when he had sat down at that terminal in the early hours of the morning and brought the system back from the edge of a catastrophic failure, the system he had built using knowledge that lived nowhere in any document that existed only in the mind of the man, everyone had agreed was a maintenance technician. He had not done it for Meridian. He had not done it for Vivian. He had not done it to prove anything to the 3 men who had been installed in his place. He had done it because the system was worth saving, because 47 companies depended on it, because Brandon and Megan and Trevor were good engineers who had made a reasonable mistake based on information they had not been given. And because, and this was the part he did not say aloud, but which was true in the honest part of him, there was something in him that could not walk past a broken thing without wanting to fix it, regardless of whether the broken thing had treated him fairly. Regardless of what it had cost him, regardless of who was watching. The cab pulled up. Darius got in. The driver glanced in the rear-view mirror. "Where to?" Darius gave his address. The cab moved into the early morning traffic, sparse, unhurried. The city between versions of itself. Darius leaned his head back against the seat. He closed his eyes. In his chest, underneath everything, there was something quiet. Not triumph. Not vindication. Something closer to the feeling of a thing done well, of a system running clean, of a problem solved at its root, rather than patched at its surface. The cab moved through the lightning streets. He was going home to make pancakes. That was for now exactly enough. If there is a final thought to leave with this story, perhaps it is the simplest one. The world will not always see you for what you truly are. Sometimes the people who hold the most knowledge will be the most overlooked. Sometimes the ones who do the deepest work will wear the plainest jackets. But the work itself, quiet, careful, done with integrity, whether anyone is watching or not, does not lose its meaning because no one applauded. A life built on that kind of work has a steadiness that no title can give and no termination letter can take away. And when you go home at the end of it all, what you are walking toward is what mattered the whole time. The small hand waiting at the kitchen table, the pancakes promised, the love that asks no resume. That is the system that is always worth saving. And that in the end is the only return on investment that ever truly matters.